Today, I'm going to discuss Tadao Ando and his design philosophies. To start, here's some basic information and architectural background. Tadao was first exposed and intrigued to architecture at a young age when he watched his own home being built. Unlike today's route of becoming a licensed architect, Tadao would not attend a higher education and receive a master's degree. He would actually read and study as much as he could from Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe at the public library. Both Mies and Corbu both had their own specific design philosophies and had their own ideas at the time, and that made them famous. Off what Tado could gather from both of them, he would consider himself a minimalist architect and would try to tie Japanese culture into his design work as his career progressed. Tado was eventually awarded the Pritzker Prize in 1995. Next is the cultural influence in Japan. The widely used teachings of Zen would be a part of his philosophy and concepts of his design over the course of his career. The origin of Zen comes from the Japanese school of Mahayana Buddhism, which would practice the skills of meditation and intuition. This would show how the Japanese people yield to nature and respect it as an overwhelming, unpredictable force. The state of calmness is achieved while using this tactic and is by the actions of intuition rather than the consciousness of Zen. What it is the appreciation of the nature cycle and the balance within it, and plays a role in modern Japanese design and architecture. The first architectural influence I would like to briefly acknowledge is Mies van der Rohe. Famous for his statement, less is more, Mies became a common architect Tata would study in his philosophies. Mies being a structuralist, he would focus on how the building would come together. Using architectural design and principle of simplicity, he would find ways to show a seamless border between indoor and outdoor space. Mises' approach to design of space would also be broadly grouped into four evolutionary stages: enclosed space, continuous space, free plan, and universal space. Le Corbusier is next, and he was heavily studied by Tadao Ando, and I could see how his work translated to Tado's later on. Corbu came up with the 5-point system. He advocated the pilotis, which is a gridded system that would eliminate load-bearing walls and form freer flowing plans and helps portray a more flexible lifestyle. The use of the golden ratio in his work would help harmonize and proportion his designs. And I think Tado Ando also would relate to his work in terms of how his open floor plans were, and even Mises to some point, and how there wasn't much of a load bearing walls. There was always a free flowing plan within everything that he was trying to build and convey an experience. And I think that falls back into both Mies and Le Corbusier early in his career and actually throughout his whole career. Now on to Tado Ando's design philosophy. Tado Ando's design philosophy is basically chalked up to having a balance of geometric forms that can be integrated into nature without disrupting the landscape it occupies. Tado also uses Japanese culture in relation to his design philosophy by respecting the nature and using it to his advantage rather than avoiding it or destroying it. Although in certain situations there is no way of avoiding disruption to a given site, he has the mindset of a physician, and that is to do no harm or minimal harm to the surrounding area and landscape when coming up to his own design concepts. Tado can be considered a critical regionalist, which would reject any idea of postmodernism in his designs. He thinks that using simple geometries can be revealed much better in the context of his design rather than another decorative style and architecture randomly placed in a given site. Looking at our first diagrams, I went ahead and stripped away all the surrounding information that goes in the Tada's floor plans and tried to find a common shape or geometry in the floor plan. These three projects all share the same shape of a circle in the floor plans. While trying to figure out why the circle is common in the floor plans, I read that the Japanese culture is a symbolic meaning for the circle. And that is, it is a symbolic meaning for the beginning, the ending of all things, and making the circle infinite. The circular shape also symbolizes connectedness, togetherness, emptiness, and fullness. Continuing with the same idea or concept within the previous slide, here are some other projects with the same concept of stripping away all the geometries and finding the same common denominator within the floor plan. When researching, you can find that Tado's use of the circle is a way to gather people, and it can be a focal point in his design scheme. Once people access the circle space, are introduced to natural light features that can be very dramatic or dimmed down and can create a vibe to how an individual can feel while being in the space and experiencing it. So depending on how much light Tadao Ando would allow to come into his space could affect one's feelings or thoughts or just seeing how they could react to a certain area, whether it be too bright, too dark, whether they feel calm in an area, or it could be very dramatic, intense. It really just depends on how much light Tado is really trying to bring in from the natural lighting instead of artificial light. And I'll talk about lighting in the next slide. Tado Ando and the use of material doesn't just end at concrete or even wood, but he considers natural light another material element in his designs, and he mentions that when doing that, it can bring architecture to life. The orientation of light can be a directional component to lead the occupants to a certain space or gathering. Tying back to the Japanese culture, Tado is very particular in his material selections and how it is formed and even placed on the site. This reminds me of how the Japanese tea ceremony is conducted, and how everything must be perfect, precise, all the way down to the finest detail. If you ever see a Japanese tea ceremony, you notice how everything is super proper, super quiet, super precise, and how everything has to be oriented and conducted in order for it to reach its completeness. And Tado, I think, uses that same type of tactic for his designs and his own buildings and how one constructs it. They would notice how much detail goes into everything that he puts into it. And that's what makes his building so special and how he cares so much about what the building is trying to convey in terms of how one might feel when they enter the space. It's not just a physical looking at it, it's about how you can interact with it and how the lighting can direct you in a way into a place of gathering, or how the walls of the concrete might feel. That could be, another sensory thing of touch and just an overall sense of getting the full human experience harmonizing with an architectural form that's within the nature that sits in. Continuing to go away from the circle component, he also forms structures using simple geometries to form spaces and relations. When looking at the first diagram, using the Boolean union tactic, he tries two simple geometries colliding and juxtaposed to make a common space that is shared between the two forms. The geometric repetition he places the same size rectangular shapes in a line, causing a repetitive sequence in the floor plan. Now, when looking at the final one for the Pulitzer Foundation for Art, I stripped away all the information that was not necessary in the context of what I was trying to find in terms of basically just two geometrically similar forms and shapes and how they can be related to one another in some type of architectural way. And when stripping away all the components, I found two rectangular shapes that had an axis in between, and that actually showed like a symmetry of how those two shapes could be placed or how they're oriented and how that forms that axial relation. And in a quote, he mentions, I create architectural order in the basis of geometry, squares, circles, triangles, and rectangles. I try to use forces in the area where I'm building to restore the unity between house and nature. In conclusion, he goes on to continue saying, I do not believe architecture should speak too much. It should remain silent and let the nature and the guise of sunlight and wind speak. What I've sought to achieve is a specialty that simulates the human spirit, awakens its sensitivity, and communicate with the deeper soul. And I think the overall idea that I've gathered from doing all this research is Tao's ability to choose a certain geometry and how that can highlight within the nature he's trying to use as a context. And I think that makes Tado nature's advocate architecture. And I think more of that should be used later on in the future for whoever else is trying to preserve nature, work with nature, not use it necessarily as an obstacle to overcome, but use it to an advantage and how you can be really organic with how you can place a building or a site and have a concept and let that be to your advantage rather than a problem. And I think the concepts and design philosophies of what Tado has shown me that.